Hey guys, what's up? My name is Amanda. Alright, so this week's Planet of the Week is very near and dear to my heart because it is one of my all-time favorite philodendrons. The lovely Jungle Boogie, or Henderson's Pride, or Tiger Tooth, or Philodendron Narrow is another name, I believe. So if you're wondering why this Jungle Boogie now looks a little bit different than it did just a second ago, it is because I just pruned it for the first time. And I wasn't planning to do it, but looking at it, I realized it really needed it. Those leaves were dying off anyway, and now it looks a lot better. You can see the 3 stems I chopped. Alright, so this plant is actually a hybrid. It's believed to be crossed with the Philodendron pinnatiforum and the Philodendron melani. I need to work on my pronunciation, but you'll see the name right here. This plant's origins usually are in South America. It has been known to grow in rainforests, riverbanks, swamps. Its growth, as you can see, is known to grow upwards, almost like a rosette type of growth, but they clearly can go a little bit sideways if not given something to climb. I definitely need to get something for this plant to climb and probably adjust it in its pot if I want to see some really nice growth. You can see down at the stem there are some little roots that are dying to just climb on something. So this plant will greatly benefit from a totem, moss pole, plank, anything you like to use, but you can leave it as is and it'll still grow just fine, although it might get a little top heavy and start to kind of fall sideways like mine's doing, but if that doesn't bother you, then you can totally keep it like that. So for sunlight, this plant in its natural habitat is known to be an understory grower. And what I mean by understory plant is that it grows under the canopy in its habitat. So whether it's in the rainforest, the swamps, or just on the banks, it's likely going to be found underneath big trees and plants, so it gets a little bit of filtered sunlight rather than super bright, harsh, direct sunlight. Knowing that, this plant definitely prefers medium to bright sunlight. You can work your way up to a little bit more on the bright side if you do it slowly. Of course, you don't want to expose your plant that's always been in low to medium light to very bright light so quickly, because that might result in the plant going into shock, getting burned, stuff like that. I would suggest a few feet from a southern window, even closer up to an eastern window. Mine gets tons of bright morning light. I'd be willing to suggest that if you can provide bright morning light, that would be great for this plant and you wouldn't have to worry about risk of burning it. Too much sunlight will result in your plant's leaf color kind of doling out. The leaves might start to look washed out, dull, faded, sometimes even a little bit of yellow in there, and that could be a good sign that, well, not a good sign, but that would mean that your plant is getting a little bit too much harsh light. And too little of sunlight will result in slower growth, and that means smaller leaves. I can see that on my plant right now. The last 2 leaves that came in were significantly smaller than the ones before that, and I think it's a mix of being wintertime, so less sunlight, and I am not supplementing a grow light for this specific plant. And I was having a problem with this plant blooming too much, so I think that was more of a factor. The plant was giving way too much energy to the blooms, but my suggestion would be medium to bright is a safe option for this plant. So for watering, the Jungle Boogie definitely prefers to not have its soil consistently moist. I would say wait for the pot to dry out a little bit, at least 50% of the pot or more to dry out before watering again. If you are someone that often overwaters and kills your plants, I would say maybe wait till the plant starts showing curled leaves and then water. Now for fertilizer, there's nothing special that this plant requires. It's very low maintenance. To make it easy, I would just say once a month fertilize. If you use a lighter fertilizer, like I use Newt, then you could get away with using that with every other water. But if you use a more nutrient-dense fertilizer, once a month, and you'll be fine. Now for repotting or potting, these plants do like to be more on the root-bound side. Now, I don't mean so root-bound that there's no soil and the pot is just full of its roots wrapped around the inside, but they would rather be a little bit snug in their pot versus having a whole excess of room in there. Now, signs your jungle boogie needs to be repotted. Tons of roots coming out of the bottom. If the top part of your plant is extremely top heavy, regardless if you have a stake in it or not, it's constantly falling over. The pot it's currently in is literally not able to hold up the base of the plant anymore. Then I would say repot. Now, when you repot, you only want to go up slightly bigger than the previous pot before. You don't want to just jump sizes to a 1 to 2 gallon pot when you were at a 6-inch pot previously. So just slightly bigger than the pot you have now is perfect. I would consider this philodendron to be more of a fast grower than slow grower. Given the right conditions, it will continuously pump out leaves for you. Now for propagating. So stem propagation is pretty much the only way you're going to be able to propagate this plant. With any philodendron, you just need to look for the joint or the node, whatever term you use, cut a few inches below that, and you can propagate using any method you like. So because this plant is a hybrid, you are not likely to get any pollen from its blooms to propagate from seed. Now it'll still definitely bloom for you. I have had tons of blooms on this plant, and recently it was a problem. I have read online that there are some people claiming that they have gotten a little tiny bit of pollen from their blooms, and every time it blooms they get a little bit of pollen from each one, and they save it all and they'll just use one big batch of all that saved up pollen and then propagate on the next bloom from there. But I am betting that I probably won't be getting any pollen on my blooms, so now I just chop them off. So I did say I had a problem recently with this plant blooming too much. The first set of blooms I got, I was very excited because it was so new and it was really cool to still see the resin being produced and the smell and the sheath opening and closing. That was all very exciting for the first 4 to 5 blooms I had on there. But while those blooms were on my plant, my leaves that were growing in were extremely small and they looked very juvenile compared to the previous growth. So that was a bummer. And once I got the experience out of the way of having blooms and knowing that I was not going to be getting any pollen from those inflorescence, then I decided I was no longer going to keep them. So after that initial set of blooming, I kept getting blooms 2 to 3 at once for the next month or so, and I would just chop them off. So there's no chance really of me getting any pollen, which would be the main reason I would keep those inflows on there. If you like the look of them and you enjoy your plant blooming, then you can totally leave them on there. But I would rather have nice big size leaves than have inflorescence on there that will not produce any pollen. So yeah, stem propagation is the only way you're gonna be able to propagate this plant, and you can use whatever method you prefer. Now for toxicity. So all parts of this plant are considered toxic because they all contain calcium oxalate crystals. I hope I pronounced that right. So when ingested, I don't think you would die right away, but you would get very sick. But I do believe that if your pets were to ingest any part of this, or probably babies, toddlers, then they could get extremely sick. I have read some people say that death and severe sickness is not an issue at all. There'll just be some mild sickness, probably throwing up, stomach problems. But to stay on the safe side, if you have pets that like to eat plants or babies that like to eat plants, maybe keep this one away from them. And there are some claims that handling this plant can be irritating to the skin. I've never dealt with any irritating symptoms from this plant, and I've never known anyone personally, but that does not mean it cannot happen. So just maybe be careful if you have extremely sensitive skin. Now for pests. So the jungle boogie is not known to attract any specific type of pest. I would recommend doing your normal pest treatment that you prefer when dealing with this plant. So it's not very sensitive and its foliage is pretty hardy, so you could probably get away with using most pest treatments, but of course I would just say to be safe, do the one that you normally do. Speaking of pests, extraflora nectaries are something that this plant produces, as do many philodendrons, and it is something that many people confuse to be a pest issue. So I've talked about this before in my videos, I believe with my philodendron Congo, and extraflora nectaries are just something that philodendrons produce in the wild because they have a symbiotic relationship with ants. Normally you'll see these little droplets on the underside, the stems of the leaves. Sometimes they're on the front of the leaves, but in my experience I've only seen them on the underside and stems. So that substance that is produced to feed the beneficial bugs. So the beneficial bugs will be attracted to that sticky substance, They'll feed on that, and in return, they will take care of and scare away any other pests that would attack the plant itself and eat its foliage. Now in your homes, you probably don't have to deal with a lot of pests coming in to eat your plants, hopefully, but the plant is still going to produce that substance and it will leave little marks on your foliage, and that is what people usually think is a result of pests. Now, having those extra floral nectaries and the little marks that it leaves behind on the leaves does not mean that you won't ever get pests. So still check your plant if you're concerned at all, but just know that seeing those little spots or droplets is not something to worry about, and it's just your plant doing what it naturally does. So for temperatures, this plant, if you live somewhere like Florida, would thrive outside. 60, 70, 80 degrees, all perfect for this plant. But if you do not live somewhere tropical like Florida or in South America, then this plant might not do so well year-round outside. I would not say that this plant is frost tolerant. 40 degrees is the coldest this plant could likely handle, and that's pushing it. If it's consistently 40 degrees, I would suggest bringing it inside if you can, or covering it. If it's just a couple times, then it might be okay, but anything close to 40 or under, it might not tolerate. So most people don't keep their homes anywhere close to 80 degrees. 70 degrees is even very warm, but it can easily tolerate the average home temperature. Especially if you can keep your home in the 60s or wherever you keep your plant, it's gonna be perfect. Sometimes my home hits like mid-high 50s and this plant is still fine. Granted, I keep it in my plant room very close to all the other plants with the humidifier going almost 24/7, so that definitely helps if it gets a little bit colder. For soil, I would try to stay on the side of a sandy, loamy, airy soil if you can. So the jungle boogie isn't too picky, but you don't want to put it in a very dense soil that's not going to allow for proper aeration or drainage. Having a very dense soil similar to that will very likely lead to root rot or any other problems. I'm not saying it always will, but you're way more likely to suffer from killing your plant or rotting of any type if you do not have a nicely aerated soil, and that goes for most plants, not just the jungle boogie. It doesn't really matter what you use for your medium, whether it's leca, relying on mostly perlite, orchid bark, whatever you like to use, as long as it is airy and well draining, you'll be fine. Alright, so that's it. If you haven't watched any of my Planty of the Week videos, I have a good handful that you can go to. So as always, you can find me here. Comment, let me know if you have this plant or if it's on your wish list. I know it was on my wish list for a very long time until I got it. So, okay, so wherever you live, I hope you have a good day, night, evening, and